Welcome to Voices of Experience. In the next half hour, we'll explore the group known as ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. What is ALEC? Who belongs to it? What are their goals? What influence does it have throughout the United States, including Minnesota? How does their program do harm to working families, the middle class? I'm Dan Mikel, President Emeritus of the Minnesota State Retiree Council, AFL-CIO, and I'll be the host for today's program. We're very honored to have with us as a guest today Bernard Brommer, President Emeritus of the Minnesota AFL-CIO. President Brommer was a very active president of Minnesota AFL-CIO for over a decade, and he began that in 1990. He brought to that position a lifetime of experience in the union movement. President Brommer is a frequent host for Voices of Experience, but today he'll be our guest. President Brommer, I thank you for your years of service on behalf of working men and women, and thank you for appearing today.
Dan, you're welcome. It's a pleasure to join you.
Okay, let's get started. Just a short sentence or two. What is the American Legislative Exchange Council, and how long has it been around?
Let me start with the second question first, Dan. It's been around since about 1973, so it's right around 40 years of existence. The organization is a nationwide entity, and it consists of two types of members, if you will. It's got the public members who are legislators who pay a nominal fee to join, and the private side are the corporations that are members, and they are involved in preparing what they refer to as model legislation, and just being good corporate citizens, they're sharing that with all the state legislatures in the land to try and advance their agenda.
Okay. Now, many of our viewers, I know, are very well read and follow the news closely, yet may not have heard of the phrase ALEC, referring to the American Legislative Exchange Council. You mentioned that there are corporate members and legislator members.
Yes.
Let's name some names as far as the corporate members are concerned.
Well, again, the corporate membership is kind of a who's list of corporations in the United States, but some examples are Walmart, AT&T, ExxonMobil, Comcast, Koch Industries, the infamous Koch brothers next door in Wisconsin, State Farm Insurance, the Coca-Cola Company, Kraft Foods, Pfizer. Virtually all of the different enterprises that you'd find on the corporate landscape in the United States have membership in some way, shape, or form in the organization.
Okay. Now, ALEC has a corporate wish list that seeks to undermine not only the gains made by men and women of labor over the years, but actually, in my opinion, destroy the labor movement. Could you provide us with some specific examples of the anti-labor nature of ALEC?
Oh, sure, Dan. Again, their agenda is pretty broad. And you can rest assured that they're not interested in advancing the issues that affect working families. For example, right at the top of their activity is an attack on regulations. They don't like any regulations that curtail the independence and the freedom of their corporate members, so they like to talk about job-killing regulations. They're opposed to those, and they try to undo them, particularly in the areas of worker safety and health. They support so-called right-to-work legislation. They're behind that. A lot of legislation that surfaced in the recent round of legislative session deals with privatization of public services, particularly in the area of education. They want to move that into the private profit-making sector and get away from public education. They are really focusing on eroding the rights of workers to engage in the collective bargaining process and to form and join unions. That's another area that they focus on. So again, they've got a very specific corporate agenda, and they use ALEC to promote that.
Now, the way that they are organized, as I'm aware, they have 9 task forces
Yes.
that study these various issues. And the corporations that you mentioned buy their way onto these task forces, 1 or 2 or 7 or 8 or 9. Can you tell us what some of these task forces are, and do any of them do any good for middle class families?
Yeah, Dan, I'm not aware, that they do any good. It's not their mission or purpose to advance the common good in the United States. They're focused entirely on the corporate agenda. And if they did do something that had a positive effect on our society and helped working class people, middle income people, it would be an accident. It wouldn't be on purpose. And the bottom line is the goal of the organization is not to make life better for people. These 9 task forces that you reference, I'm sure, and I don't have a specific list of those task forces, but they all include corporate membership, legislative membership, and they draft model legislation that then they so generously share with state legislatures all across the country.
Okay, I'll mention some of the task forces.
Sure, if you've got some that
I'm aware of some of them, maybe not all of them, but civil justice, public schools you mentioned.
Public education.
Yeah, public education, health and human services, international relations, tax and fiscal policy, public safety, and elections.
The usual list of suspects that, would obviously benefit their corporate agenda.
Yeah,
If they
I mean,
were able to get
it almost
something
sounds like a full cross-section of committees before the state legislature or before the U.S. Congress.
Right, and you mentioned they buy their way onto these. They've got a membership fee. It's nominal for legislators, but corporations pay anywhere from $5,000 to $50,000 annually. And then if they want to have their lobbyists, and a lot of them are lobbyists that represent these corporations, sit on these task forces, that costs them another anywhere from $1,500 to $10,000 to participate in these task forces.
Okay. To me, that's a lot of money.
It's an awful lot of money.
Yeah. Now let's get local. To what extent do some members of the state legislature from Minnesota buy into this group in the sense of joining this group? And this group appears to be doing more for the 1% of this country than those of us in the 99%.
Absolutely, totally, Dan. I mean, all you have to do is look at their agenda, and you can tell at first blush that this isn't something that they're, again, advancing for the common interest. As far as Minnesota goes, I understand there's probably about 30 legislators who are participants, who are members of the organization, and I believe every one of those are Republicans. There's not a single Democrat that is a member of this organization from Minnesota. Some of the leaders are involved as members. House Speaker Kurt Zellers, for example, is a member. Majority Leader in the House, Matt Dean is a member. Former Secretary of State Mary Kiffmeyer, I believe, is now a House member. She chairs the organization in Minnesota. So they and the education chairs, as I understand it, in the legislature are all members. So they pick out very powerful positions, selective positions, and they get all the information. They don't need everybody in the caucus to join ALEC. They just need the key people, and the draft or model legislation is funneled in through the state that way, and it's dumped in the legislative hopper.
Now, in the British system, they have what they call backbenchers, people who are members of the House of Commons in Great Britain, but do not serve in leadership positions. But in Minnesota, these people are not backbenchers, but are at the forefront.
Yes, they are. They're leaders, and they are, in fact, super lobbyists for the organization and for these pieces of legislation that the corporations want introduced.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you a difficult subject.
Fire away.
Question, I should say. How does ALEC differ from any other group that seeks to lobby, such as the Chamber of Commerce, the Farmers Union, or even AFL-CIO? I mean, all three of those, Chamber of Commerce, Farmers Union, Minnesota AFL-CIO, are all well-organized groups and have always been lobbying at the legislature. How is ALEC different?
Well, I think it's markedly different, Dan, in a number of ways. The organizations that you mentioned, of course, all have a Minnesota focus. And their legislative agendas almost exclusively percolate up from their membership. They're not reaching outside of the border, for example, to find out what Florida is doing or what California is doing. Their membership organizations, there's transparency there. Again, when the Chamber of Commerce comes into the legislature, when the Minnesota Farmers Union comes in, when the Minnesota AFL-CIO appears before a committee, you know who they are. They identify themselves and they indicate that this is a legislative proposal of their respective organizations, and they lobby on that, which is entirely appropriate. Their positions, their proposals are clearly spelled out. The legislators know who they are. They're identified. It's not hidden like ALEC is. And, they have specific goals and not model legislation that is what ALEC is putting on the boards. And ALEC is trying, I think, to use their influence, their power, and their money to have a nationwide distribution system to try and get what I call the effect of just a groundswell of support for these issues. If they can get something introduced in 20 or 25 or 30 or 35 states, well, obviously these states don't want to become islands and somehow irritate these corporations. They want to go along with the majority. And there again, you get that momentum that's going with having all of these issues dumped into all of these legislative bodies at virtually the same time.
So in the state of Minnesota, if the Farmers Union has a particular interest in a particular piece of legislation, they'll probably have some farmers from Minnesota at a legislative hearing to testify or to observe. AFL-CIO will do the same thing. Chamber of Commerce would have some local businessmen or businesswomen, and quite often, each group will try to have a tie-in to one or more of the legislators that they're trying to convince of one thing or another. But ALEC is just this nationwide.
That's right, Dan. And again, a good way to think about it is, of course, when you mention these organizations, Minnesota-based organizations, they're clearly identified, and they have rank and file members, a small business person, a farmer, a small farmer, local union member from northeastern Minnesota, wherever it happens to be, and they're identified. When these model bills are dumped into the legislative hopper, nobody stands up and say, well, this is from the American Legislative Exchange Council and they'd like to see this become law in Minnesota. That's not the way these things are presented. Very rarely, if ever, is it known that the genesis of these measures are from ALEC.
Okay. Now, I do know that state legislators belong to a national group called the National Conference on State Legislators, which appears to me to be a nonpartisan group of people in similar situations around the country. I know they have a conference, but they don't have any corporate members. It's strictly members of a legislature. Am I correct in that?
You are correct,